Can people hear me? Because I know there was no sound for the audio. So is my audio coming through on YouTube? I know there's some delay, but if you could signal in the chat whether you can hear me. You have to wait for the YouTube stream to finish then. What should we do? I don't think I'm going to be heard. Can people hear me? Because I know there was no sound for the audio. So is the audio? Okay, so it sounds like even if Seb was muted, a feat that few have managed to do, or at least his cartoon version, we can be heard. So I'm sure you'll get many opportunities to see our trailer again. Welcome to the first session, the opening session of Historical Materialism 2021, which goes under the title The Return of the State, Anti-Capitalist Politics in a New Ecological Landscape. And this is the beginning of 11 days of Marxist events and discussions and book launches and various things. My name's Esther Leslie. I'm Professor of Political Aesthetics at Birkbeck in London, and I am a member of the Historical Materialism Journal Editorial Board. I'm going to introduce the speakers in reverse order and then give over the floor to them. They'll each be making their contribution of up to and around 20 minutes. Then we'll come back for discussion. Please put your questions in through the chat, and we'll pick them out and try to get a good discussion going between us. So in reverse order then, we have Paolo Gerbaudo, who's a sociologist and political theorist at King's College London. We have Mike Wayne, professor in film and media at Brunel University. And we have Panagiotis Sotiris, who teaches at the Hellenic Open University and is also a member of the HM Editorial Board. And just to get a plug in for another of our events, this time next week will be the Deutsche lecture, Panagiotis's recent book, A Philosophy for Communism, Rethinking Althusser, which came out with Brunel in 2020, is on the short list for the Deutsche Prize. And this time next week, we'll have last year's prize winner's lecture, which is John Bellamy Foster, talking about his work on ecology and Marxism. And we'll have the announcement of this year's prize winner. So I hope you will all tune in and be back for that next week. So now I'll just hand over the floor then to Panagiotis to begin. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Esther. Well, one of the arguments that appeared during the pandemic was that measures taken by government, especially the suspension of economic activity, even at the danger of economic depression, offered proof of the crisis of neoliberalism and the possibility to use state power to promote social change in a socialist direction. According to this argument, a strong state intervention in the sense of a government by decree that could halt aspects of capitalist production, commandeer parts of the production apparatus, and impose strict forms of regulation of everyday life, offers an example of that it is possible to impose change through a strong state. Even the disciplinary aspects of lockdown strategies have been embraced as aspects of this positive potential. This has been enhanced by the return of the state debate, even among organic intellectuals of capital, which seemed like a negation of an earlier neoliberal anti-statism, which had led social movements to defend state functions against privatizations, along with the appreciation of the Chinese state's handling of the pandemic. In contrast, far-right populists have appeared as defenders of liberties against pandemic restrictions. Of course, we know that there has never been an actual neoliberal anti-statism, and neoliberal states have always been authoritarian and disciplinary and with large-scale state interventions. However, the crucial question is whether we can think social transformation as expansion of state power and interventions, since the classical definition of the transitions to communism included always a withering away of the state. And indeed, Marx's notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat includes a strong sense of coercion in regards to the violent reappropriation of the means of production and the transformation of property relations, exemplified in the Communist Manifesto's call for, and I quote, despotic inroads on the rights of property under the conditions of bourgeois production, end of quote, along with calls for the, and I quote again, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly, the centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state, and the extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, end of quote. But it's explicitly stated that the state referred to here is not the existing, but something deeply transformed, something evident in the tension running through the phrase, again from the manifesto, the state that is the proletariat organized as the ruling class. Even in a text by Engels and Dühring, which was to become a reference point for the Second International, there's a clear warning against any thinking of just using a strong existing state. The modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalist, the ideal personification of the total national capital, end of quote. And in the Civil War in France, Marx insisted that we're talking about a transformed state apparatus and not just using existing apparatuses. Again, quote, one thing especially was proved by the Commune, that is, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. And of course, there is the critique of any simple use of the existing state by Marx in the critique of the Gotha program, his distrust against, and I quote, education of the people by the state, and his insistence that the state needs a very stern education by the people, which is presented as a process of historical experimentation. And I quote, the question can only be answered scientifically, is Marx's phrase. However, there was also a strong statist tradition in the working class movement associated with figures such as Lassalle, and his conception of a socialism based on the expansion of the role of the state and an idealization of the state as condensation of humanity's rational capacity as an ethical whole. In contrast, in Lenin's formulations in State and Revolution and the accompanying material, one could see a complex articulation of the strong state and the Soviets. And it was Lenin who offered an important reading of the lessons of the Commune with the outlines of a definition of forms of power from below that go beyond the simple use of the existing state apparatuses, in phrases such as direct initiative of the people from below, replacement of the police and the army, special control of the officialdom, etc. Leaving aside that this might sound as schematic, they still point to the crucial question, namely the need for non-state autonomous organizations as part of the exercise of power, forms of political organizations that attempt to subsume the state, exercise forms of transformative control upon it, and enable a politicization of the economic sphere. Here we find the importance of the very notion of dual power, which in this reading is not a moment, but an organic and more permanent aspect of any process of revolutionary transformation. In the complex situation created by the realities and difficulties of the Russian Revolution and the Civil War, priorities seem to change, yet the question whether we're just dealing with an expansion of centralized power and the role of non-state entities re-emerged, albeit in an overdetermined manner, in the debates around trade unions and the critiques from various oppositionist currents. And indeed, the debate on the role of trade union is indicative of the centrality of this question. And despite the canonization of Lenin's response in this, it was a very time-specific intervention and not a strategic positioning. And of course, one could also point to the persistence of the councilist tradition outside the Soviet Union. Moreover, Gramsci's references to statolatry can be also considered a critique of the Stalinist emphasis on strong state power. And although Gramsci seems to accept as a provisional or transitory condition a form of Soviet Bonapartism, when the subaltern classes have not had an extended period of independent cultural and moral development of their own, in Gramsci's words, at the same time he offers clear warnings, and I quote from Gramsci. This kind of statolatry must not be abandoned to itself. Above all, it must not become theoretical fanaticism or come to be seen as perpetual. It must be criticized precisely in order for it to develop and to produce new forms of state life in which individual and group initiative has a state character, even if this is not indebted to the official government, end of quote. This need for statolatry to be criticized and not become perpetual and theoretical fanaticism in order to move forward with social transformation based on subaltern initiative moves beyond the identification of socialism with a strong state. However, the way the Soviet model was exported did create a sense of the strong state as vector of social transformation. State ownership and planning seem to be basic aspects of socialist transitions, and this could also set an example for a developmental state enhancing process of democratic modernization and decolonization. Only the first phase of the Cultural Revolution and the Sankai Commune suggested a return to the logic of non-state independent political forms of organization, even though this was also soon abandoned. The Western communist movement, along with social democracy, started to treat the state as inherently progressive. A democratized state implementing reforms and using economic planning, along with expansion of public ownership, were presented as the essence of a democratic progressive government. The expansion of the state and the socialization of production within state monopoly capitalism were presented as the objective tendencies towards socialism, ending in the idealization of the state as antechamber of socialism. Against this, one could point to the critique of welfare state offered by various forms of Marxist radicalism, the critique of a technocratic society proposed by critical theory, the various radical critiques of the role in of the state in social production, and radical movements within the context of the global 1968 went beyond demanding just an expansion of state education and health systems, offering a critique of capitalist social reproduction. Louis Althusser, in a certain way, encapsulated this, and I quote from an intervention from 1976, to destroy the bourgeois state in order to replace it with the state of the working class and its allies is not to add the adjective democratic to its existing state apparatus. It is to transform the forms of the division of labor between the repressive political and ideological apparatuses. It is to revolutionize their methods of work and the bourgeois ideology that dominates their practices. It is to assure them new relations with the masses in response to mass initiatives. And even Poulanja's relational conception of the state as the condensation of a social relation of forces, sometimes misread as a call for struggles within the state, was also combined with an insistence on autonomous forms of organization of the masses as part of his strategy for democratic socialism. Poulanja's fear was that any call simply for a withering away of the state, interpreted as doing away with representative democracy in favor of rank and file participation, would eventually lead again to technocracy and statism. However, he admits, and I quote, left to itself, the transformation of the state apparatus and the development of representative democracy would be incapable of avoiding statism. Hence the need to combine, and I quote again, the transformation of representative democracy with the development of forms of rank and file democracy or the movement for self-management. I would suggest that the question of dual power constantly reemerges whenever the dynamics of social movements and political contestation challenge the existing configuration of power. In its case, the open question is what to do with those autonomous organizations that are not just instruments of struggle, but forms of counterpower or power from below. This arises not only as an article of faith in an insurrectionary conception of revolutionary process, but also as a way to answer with political challenges in a spectrum from the Bolivia of René Zavaleta Mercado to the debates around left Eurocommunism. The crisis of the communist and revolutionary socialist movement from the 1980s always led to a disregard of such questions. However, this resurfaced in the context of movements in Latin America, from the way the Zapatistas chose to organize in opposition to the state, to contradictions in the relations between the state and autonomous movements within the revolutionary processes in Venezuela or Bolivia. For example, in Bolivia, Álvaro García Linera has referred to the creative tensions within the Bolivian revolutionary process in the period that followed the failed coup of 2008, the contradictory relations between the state and social movements, including the effort for the state to take over some of the functions of social movements and community institutions. Linera has used Gramsci's notion of the integral state to describe this process. However, it is indicative of the actual contradictions of this approach, that this is described both as a dilution of the state within society and as an expansion of a democratized state. And I think that it is imperative to pick up this debate again. The denial of any instrumentalist theory of the state as a tool of the bourgeoisie or of any crude class reductionism that disregards the relative autonomy of the superstructures cannot lead us to an idealization of the state. In contrast, we need to rethink the state as the material condensation of a relation of force, with the emphasis on material condensation, which suggests both a relational character, the constant effectivity of class struggle, but also the fact that it is the materialization of a relation of forces that enables bourgeois domination and, to a different extent, hegemony. The class character of the state is deeply inscribed in its institutional architecture, in the ways knowledge and information is circulated, in how apparatuses are insulated against any form of democratic control, a process enhanced by the transfer of authority to various levels of experts, the militarization of the security and police apparatus, and the pervasive logic of independent agencies and independent central banks. Consequently, a suspicion, to say the least, of the state is always in the order of the day. The necessary clash with the ersatz and statism of neoliberalism should not lead to a simple support or defense of the existing state forms and the class strategies inscribed in them. When we prefer public services to private, this does not mean that we are dealing with socially neutral institutions. Public education, to give an example, can also be a process for the reproduction of class hierarchies, the social division of labor, and aspects of the dominant ideology. And moreover, the crucial aspect that makes such state services public has to do with the fact that there are important movements in them that oppose aspects of the role in the reproduction of capitalist social relations and represent the interests, needs, and aspirations of the subaltern classes. It is on the basis of the above that I would like to suggest that we can find in the Marxist tradition another theoretical and practical current that attempts to rethink social transformation as a process of experimentation that is based not just on the expansion of state power, but also on the emergence of forms of popular power and counter-power from below, along with profound transformations of the state, in short, a contemporary version of dual power. Autonomous movements and initiatives, from trade unions to self-management and even collective self-defense, are crucial aspects, even if the political representatives of the subaltern classes have indeed reached political power. Consequently, not all forms of a stronger state contribute to social change. It is one thing to use political power to promote changes, even institutionally violent, towards the expansion of public ownership or the reduction of the role of the market, from price controls to raising the minimum wage, and another to treat it as a form of a positively strong state, what we have witnessed, for example, during the pandemic, the expansion of police power, the restriction of political freedom, such as the right to assembly, the new forms of surveillance, and the authoritarian aspects of the lockdown strategy. This is not a blueprint for the despotic inroads of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is authoritarian neoliberalism on steroids. It is true that aspects of the return of the state debate, such as the inability of the markets to act as rational optimizers, are important. The same goes for having state agencies that indeed act to delimitate the private from the public, the market from the terrain of social needs and aspiration, but it is also important to think about ways to bring forward the initiative and ingenuity of the subaltern, moving beyond the fetishism of the market and the fetishism of the state, which represent the double process of mystification of social relations of domination and exploitation. This would also entail a profound transformation of the state in the sense of creating ways that social antagonism becomes more apparent and active within it, forcing forms of openness and democratic accountability, putting crucial aspects under social control, reducing the size, power, and opacity of the oppressive apparatuses, introducing new forms of democratic participation at all levels, and expanding basic political freedoms against all forms of oppression, including the pervasive development of a surveillance state. If we think contemporary challenges, the need to move beyond the call for a strong state becomes evident. In the case of the pandemic and the failure of the lockdown strategy to deliver, the challenge has been not of suspending social life, but of collectively inventing ways and practices that make it safer by redesigning production and reproduction on the basis of solidarity and collective mobilization, and not coercion and enhanced surveillance. In the case of climate change, the extent of the need for changes in productive and consumer paradigms and the increased need for decentralization and collective use of limited resources also entails a collective redesigning of production that goes beyond state coercion and requires collective initiative and self-management. And I think that a note by Gramsci from 1930 offers some insight, and I quote, "It is not possible to create a constitutional law of the traditional type on the basis of this reality, which is in continuous movement. It is only possible to create a system of principle asserting that the state's goal is its own end, its own disappearance, in other words, the reabsorption of political society into civil society." I think that this opposition between constitutional law and system of principle does not suggest some form of unrestrained revolutionary practice or substituting the state with Soviet-type institutions, but the need to think of both the state and the movements inside and outside of it as parts of the same process of experimentation, a new practice of politics that supersedes the division of the economic and the political within bourgeois society and attempts to create conditions for a subaltern universality opposed to both the abstract universality of the state and the particularity of corporate interests. To conclude, the idea that the state can be the main agency of social rationality and represent the collective effort towards an emancipated and just society has a long history. This was the main question that the political philosophy of modernity faced, and some of the answers offered were indeed elaborate, suggesting the complex mediations between the state, civil society, and the possibility of moving from particular interests towards a universal conception of freedom and justice. However, one of Marx's actual epistemological breaks was the idea that social emancipation was a process that will not be state-driven. It will not be a self-transformation of the state, not in the sense of a technocratic replacement of the government of persons by the administration of things, but as the constant expansion of new forms of an agonistic democratic political participation at all levels, including that of the economy, of new forms of collective management, of new forms of political civility, and consequently of new and original forms of institutionalization in a process that is going to be both contradictory and experimental. And I think that this is still the challenge we face today. Thank you.
Thank you, Panagiotis. Let's hand over to Mike for his contribution.
Okay, great. So thanks. That's a really nice survey of Marxist philosophy of state and revolution. So now my contribution is sort of taking us to something very specific, the political cultures of the British state. So how do we navigate between the dangers posed by static, abstract models of the state on the one hand, and a descent into empirical particularities on the other? How do we navigate between reducing the state to an instrument of the dominant classes, or alternatively autonomizing it substantively from socio-economic relations? So for me, the answer lies in the kind of historicism pioneered by Gramsci, where historical specificity is fused with a complex conceptual framework from which general patterns can be discerned across time and space. Concepts like historic block, hegemony, and conjuncture constituted decisive advances in historical materialism, building on the work of Marx and Lenin. So, for example, Gramsci's concepts are implicit in Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte. What Marx does there is in stark contrast to what Engels says he is doing in his preface to the third edition of the 18th Brumaire after Marx's death. So according to Engels, political and other practices of the superstructure are, quote, only the more or less clear expression of struggles of social classes. Now, the term clear expression is unfortunate with its reflectionist epistemology because it abolishes contradiction. And it is precisely the contradictions between classes and their forms of political expression which governs Marx's analysis of that text. So I want to take this notion of contradictions between political cultures and the dominant class interests into my elaboration of Gramsci's concepts. So some key reasons why capital as a band of warring brothers might be in contradiction with the political management of its interests include the tension between short-term and long-term interests of capital, the tension between what might be beneficial for one capital or sector of capital and what might be disadvantageous to other capitals or sectors of capital, the tension between maximizing returns to capital and the need to make material concessions as the basis of hegemony, that is, domination with a degree of consent and moral political leadership, and the tensions between the actual consequences of capitalism and the moral political life world of the political cultures that have been developed to manage these and other contradictions. So, for example, liberalism's belief that productivity gains are the basis of capitalism's historic justification, when increasingly capitalism relies on rent and debt to swell profit margins. So to think of the state as shaped by political cultures is to think of it as a historical organism, a building in constant renovation, changing, adapting, with new floors and wings being added. Overall, there is a dynamic between transformation and long continuities. So this is the model that I've been working with recently in diagram form. It's a conflict, alliance, and contradiction model. The most historically successful and dominant political cultures of the British multi-nation state are conservatism, liberalism, and economic liberalism. And it's important to distinguish between social liberalism and economic liberalism. This trinity of alliance between them has shaped much of British history, apart from the social democratic interlude. This triangle represents the current historic bloc, which has been developing since the 1980s. As partners, they share certain commitments in terms of their defense of capitalism, and it's on this basis that there are overlaps and alliances and mutual influencing between all of these political cultures. But conservatism and liberalism also compete to be the leadership cadres of economic liberalism. Now, the latter is a political culture, it does have a philosophy, but I'm here using it primarily as the dynamics of capitalism in the kind of pure state that Marx analysed in Capital. So you'll detect here the shadow of the base superstructure model, but it's one able to respect the relative autonomy of the political using these vectors of conflict and contradiction. So as competitors, conservatism and liberalism, there are differences between them that are important. And following the 2007 crash, they've widened, moving from tactical differences to strategic differences on both the question of interstate relations, EU, Brexit, and how political cultures build a block of support outside this ruling bloc, and what blending and types of force and consent to use. That is to say, these are intra-class relations, and then what's the relationship between these intra-class relations and inter-class relations? But what I'd say right now is that neoliberalism or economic liberalism is dominant without being hegemonic. Each political culture has its constituency of supporters for sure, but broader regional loyalty is threadbare, I think. So instead, we have increasingly desperate day-to-day managing of major crises, at least in the UK. The one caveat to this, I would say, is that liberalism has become remarkably hegemonic over the left, inside and outside the Labour Party and within the trade unions. I'll come back to that later, but let's stay with the intra-class relations within this triangle of power. So the relationship between conservatism and liberalism is also determined by the differential, contradictory relations they both have with economic liberalism, which has a tendency to liquidate aspects of the moral political life worlds of these two respective political cultures. Each political culture tries to use these liquidationist tendencies in their competition with one another. So, for example, liberalism exploits the kind of internationalist tendencies of capitalism to develop supranational organizations that undermine conservatism's dominance of the nation state, while conservatism, by contrast, uses economic crises to erode liberalism's investments in, say, multilateralism and multiculturalism. So we can switch this structural model of the political and economic dynamics into a temporal historical one to briefly remind us of the recent history of this historic bloc. So it's been in place since 1979 in this country, up to the present. And within this period, we can identify three conjunctures, pegging them to electoral outcomes, which are, of course, also symptoms of deeper shifts and currents. So the era of liberalism stretches across Blair's New Labour and the Cameron and Clegg coalition government of 2010 to 15, with the crash of 2007 to 8 being an important moment when progressive economic liberalism, to quote Nancy Fraser, starts to run out of juice. Progressive economic liberalism is sandwiched on both sides by conservative economic liberalism, which no more than liberalism can be exclusively identified with one party. In this country, we've had UKIP and the Brexit Party have been significant players for a period of time in recent history. But of course, it is the Conservative Party that are the exemplary successful model of this political culture. Now, the symmetry between the two conservative economic liberal blocs should not blind us to the fact that they are operating in very different historical conditions. And so this poses the question of whether the conservatism of the Thatcher era, which we should remember Andrew Gamble famously defined as strong state free market, is it the same as Johnson's iteration of conservative economic liberalism today? Something that we'll come back to. So schematically, we can say that conservatism has always been invested in and built its political culture around the strong state, the coercive organs of the state, the armed forces, the police, the judiciary, and criminal justice system. And it's dressed the mailed fist up with a set of institutions infused with a reactionary romanticism, the Crown, of course, preeminent, but also the Houses of Commons and Lords, the legislature and executive project themselves as both the outcome of democratic representation, but at the same time, they associate their monopoly of political power with civilization itself. See, for example, how the Parliamentary Labour Party refused to accept the outcome of the 2015 leadership elections that were decided by party members. Again, conservatism is a political culture, not to be narrowed down to a political party. There's plenty of conservatism in the Labour Party. The supranational state that is the United Kingdom historically shaded off into empire and later the Commonwealth, providing additional sources of both ideological hegemony and material concessions for conservatism that, for example, were important in integrating Wales and Scotland into the supranational state. Conservatism's most notable spread into civil society is via the question of the land, farming, agriculture, the village, the coast, the border, the boundary. There's been a lot of good historical research exploring this. But from Disraeli's One Nation Toryism to Johnson's Conservative Party, the Tories have known that hegemony also requires at least some material concessions. It can't all be about symbolic cultural compensations, important as these are in framing and defining problems and solutions. And material concessions, if you like, the rational kernel for consent to be granted, and the political cultural frameworks that make them, of course, shape the state. So the political culture of labourism and social democracy, and before that, a radical reforming liberalism of the Lord Lloyd George type, built the welfare state with nationalised industries and socialised services. And the social democratic state was the one that the Labour Party once championed, although of course they never took on those parts of the state that make conservatism powerful, such as the ones I've already indicated, or such as the link between the Treasury and the city. But once the Labour Party uncoupled itself from social democracy, what has it got left to build that is distinctive or popular? Nothing really, hence the void that is Keir Starmer, who has failed to realise that it is not 1997 anymore. Progressive or liberal neoliberalism is liberalism that has uncoupled itself from its former support for social democracy, and it has now realigned itself with economic liberalism, from which it had started to split in the mid-19th century in this country. Liberalism has been historically happiest in building those parts of the legal state that protects individual rights, rather than the coercive state that conservatism has developed. Although, of course, liberalism will use the conservative coercive state whenever it has to. Its core concept has always been the abstract citizen. In recent years, it has really taken on the conservative nation state, seeking to uncouple rights and belonging from a specific ethnicity. And this has allowed liberalism to fill its abstract conception of the state with a new, diverse, multicultural content. Thus, it has reconstructed the British state philosophically and also, to some extent politically, with real political impacts, as a liberal progressive entity, precisely because, this is the argument, it is a state made up of multiple nations, and a state which through empire and then the more consensual arrangements of the Commonwealth gradually diversified its identity. Thus, liberalism has added multiculturalism to its political culture, and importantly, has appropriated and buried the left's earlier history of anti-racist and anti-fascist solidarity. This new conception of the nation state served the Scottish independence movement well in the 2014 referendum. Having uncoupled Scottishness from an exclusively cultural signifier, they were able to define an independent Scotland in terms of a political alternative to Westminster, with some gestures towards social democracy that was open to Scottish citizens irrespective of their culture. Unionists who moaned during the referendum about Scottish nationalism completely missed the point. Closely connected to liberal neoliberalism's vision of a multicultural state was its commitment to multilateral governance structures in the field of international relations, hence its commitment to the EU. Here, the reach of liberalism over the Labour Party membership, the left more generally, and the Labour movement was to prove fatally weakening to the Corbyn project. For many, redistribution of wealth was to play second fiddle to staying in the EU, or at best, redistribution of wealth was unimaginable without reversing the result of the 2016 vote. Someone I knew said to me, oh, it's like, socialism in one country, leaving the EU, to which you might reply, well, better that than socialism in no country. But anyway, progressive neoliberalism was unable to discern how liberalism was feeding illiberalism, a central contradiction that was about to blow apart the ruling class consensus on membership of the EU. This was the fault line on which competition between political cultures, these two political cultures, for leadership of the neoliberal state went beyond agreed boundaries, and fissures opened up within the historic bloc. While liberal conservatives of the Cameron-Osborne wing of the Conservative Party joined the liberals in the other parties, the bulk of conservative political culture was seeking to capture the post-2008 crash discontent with austerity to supercharge their long-held suspicion that the EU was a threat to conservative-dominated institutions of the British state. Hence their loathing, for example, of the European Court of Justice and their fears of a European army emerging in the future. Championing British sovereignty against the institutions of the EU, but not, of course, against transnational capitalism, was to be the means to transition the British state into a new set of international trading and geopolitical coordinates, although the linchpin of this, a trade deal with the US, remains blocked until the British government and the EU can come to a lasting deal on the nature of the border between the EU and the north of Ireland, a little residue of empire that must gall the Tories. Having mobilised the language of national sovereignty, will the symbolic cultural consolations of national identity be enough electorally for the Conservatives? The so-called levelling up agenda suggests they have to deliver something, those material concessions once again, not least for those 52 seats they captured off Labour in the small towns of the north of England, whose new Conservative MPs have formed themselves into the Northern Research Group. This is a new calculus that Major and Thatcher did not have to make, and there are others as well. 40 years of neoliberalism has so degraded and commodified the infrastructure of life that the political cultures of conservatism and liberalism are now suffering a major crisis of legitimacy. When I say the infrastructure of life, I mean both human capital and fixed capital. Theresa May's only solution to the crisis in affordable care in old age in the 2017 election was to propose asset stripping homeowners. In my view, neoliberalism is dominant but not hegemonic. It is confronted with the problem of finding from somewhere the scope for the material concessions that could help rebuild hegemony. But where? Thatcher had North Sea oil receipts to spend on ballooning unemployment benefits and a rich set of public assets to sell off to build her brand of popular capitalism. Neoliberalism has cunningly opened up the public purse to the corporate snouts, thanks to New Labour, reminding us that public spending for a rentier economy is not in contradiction with neoliberalism. But nominally, public services will deliver less and less to the user and more to the shareholder. This is another contradiction that has to be managed. The NHS is a key battleground here. Neoliberalism has also driven down the tax take on the corporations and the rich, cutting off another source of funding. And the neoliberal state, which smashed British manufacturing and built instead a barista or service sector economy, suffers the problems of services generally, the difficulty of raising productivity. British capital sits on global cash deposits of £900 billion, up from pre-COVID levels of £750 billion. But with low productivity, a downward pressure on the rate of profit, capital is essentially on an investment strike. Although conservatism cannot rely merely on symbolic cultural compensations, such as nationalism, those symbolic cultural compensations do have considerable power to define the terms of the problem and the possible solutions. The outcome of the Brexit tussle is testament to this, but it is an outcome that presses down hard on the fault lines of the nation state. Brexit was a victory for an English nationalism with which English liberalism could not compete. But elsewhere, the competition between conservatism and liberalism is played out differently. In Scotland, liberalism with a slight shuffle towards social democracy has prevailed. And here liberalism is linked to a project of national sovereignty, albeit a cosmopolitan one that is quite different to the reactionary conservative model that has won out in England. As a result, Boris Johnson could yet be the last Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. That would be an earthquake for the state. It would be nice if the left could contribute to these intra-ruling class contradictions and intensify them, instead of being largely spectators of a history made by this historic bloc.
Thank you, Mike. And let's hand over to Paolo for our final speaker contribution. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and it was a pleasure to listen to Panagiotis and Michael on the very complex nature of the state in relation to Marxist theory. And indeed, the question of the state, the question of the nature and the role of the state and how the left should approach the state has been one of the most burning questions for Marxist theories, for Marxist theory. I mean, now many people say that we are in a way back to the 70s, that the 2020s have some similarities to the 70s. They're referring to the energy crisis. They are referring to inflation or the scare of inflation. And one of the elements that definitely has some similarities with the 70s is the debate on the state. I mean, the fact that historical materialism dedicates this year's conference theme to the state is obviously a reminder of what is perhaps the most famous debate in Marxist theory in the post-war period, the Miliband-Poulantzas debate in the New Left Review, which lasted between 1969 and 1976, which was very much about these questions, namely, what is the state? What is the function of the state? What is the relationship of the state, or more precisely, of the capitalist state and the capitalist system? And finally, the most important question of all, namely, how should socialists approach the state? What should be the strategy vis-a-vis the state from the left? In the case of the Miliband-Poulantzas debate, we know that it was a debate that had to do with the reason why the state was such a major obstacle to the transformation of society. And we also know that Poulantzas and Miliband proposed different theories about why this was the case, with Miliband focusing more on the question of the state personnel being either bourgeois by origin or becoming bourgeois in the course of time and being therefore recuperated by the state, while with Poulantzas, the idea was that the state was structurally designed to reproduce the conditions of production of the capitalist system, and therefore the nature and the origins of the state personnel was ultimately a secondary question, was ultimately a corollary of the structural nature of the capitalist state. And in so doing, they were dealing with what appeared to them as a major political and theoretical dilemma, one that had famously been raised by Louis Althusser, namely the difficulty of Marxist theory to get to grips with the state. I mean, if we read Althusser and then we read Poulantzas and Miliband, we find almost identical expression highlighting this blind spot of Marxist theory. The fact that he was not part of the system, that the reasoning around the state was marginal. Besides the obvious formulation that has already been noted, I mean, the idea of the state as an apparatus of coercion in the service of capital, the state as a disciplinary machine that is completely subservient to the logic of the capitalist class. And connected to that, the idea that the revolution would imply the withering away of the state, namely the disappearance of the state, and instead kind of society acquiring political power completely. Though there is a clear difference, and we know that from studies of the political works of Karl Marx and Engels, between the, say, long-term vision that Marx and Engels had about the state, their notion of the state, which was to a great extent derived from their experience of the authoritarian state of the 19th century, a very repressive state that wanted to maintain the old order, and then their more pragmatic engagement with political strategy, in which they often suggested that in the short to medium term, it was necessary for socialists, on the one hand, to also pursue reformist policies to improve the condition of workers, therefore to use the state to that end, and that it was necessary to create forms of government, of popular government, as Marx puts it, in the Civil War in France, in order to organize the working class. So starting from this general premise, Poulantzas and Miliband wanted to account better for the what Gramsci already, in a way, instituted as the idea of the autonomy of the political. The impression that politics was more complex than a linear relationship between the economic and the political would suggest that the idea of a kind of simple determination of the economic on the political suggested. But and in so doing, they tried to afford more autonomy to the superstructural, and specifically to the two key components of the superstructural, namely the state and ideology. However, what is remarkable is how diverse the state that Miliband and Poulantzas were commenting on is from the state we are discussing now. Namely, in a way, we stand at the opposite point in history, or at an opposite point in history vis-a-vis Poulantzas and Miliband. What Poulantzas and Miliband witnessed was the very peak of the social democratic state, a state that was very interventionist, that engaged in planning, either mandatory, as in the case of the Soviet Union and Soviet satellite states, or indicative planning, right, which was a major element, especially in economies like France, Italy, and many others, with a state setting targets that the economy was expected to fulfill. While the state that we are witnessing now is a state that is moving away from the neoliberal state, namely a model of state where state interventionism is limited, where the coercive apparatus of the state has a preeminence over the other phases of the state, and towards a different model of state, a neo-interventionism, as I describe it in my work, where after 40 years of discussions about the rollback of the state, about the reduction of the power of the state, we seem to be witnessing exactly the reversal of this process, namely a return of the state interventionism in terms of public investments, in terms of new forms of social security, and more generally in terms of providing the population of attending demands for protection that are coming from citizens at a time when there are only too many reasons to be afraid and to demand protection, including, besides the pandemic and the economic crisis, the threat of climate change that very much overshadows the contemporary historical horizon. So the best way to approach this question, the nature of the state and the neoliberal state and the neo-interventionist state that in my argument we're witnessing in the 2020s, is to refer to different state apparatuses. I mean, one of the contribution of Althusserian theory was to highlight that besides repressive state apparatuses, there are also ideological state apparatuses. Apologies for the repetition in the slide. I mean, obviously, ISA are ideological state apparatuses, in which Althusser included a number of institutions, agencies, and entities ranging from the school to the university to the press, to different other components of society that normally people would not understand as part of the state, but more as part of civil society, but that, as we know from Gramsci, are part of what Gramsci calls the integral state, namely the sum of civil society and political society. Though often what is quite overlooked in the Marxist analysis of the state is that beside the ISA, the ideological state apparatuses, and the RSA, the repressive state apparatuses, there are also the ESA, I mean the economic state apparatuses, which come in very different shapes and forms. They obviously include the various institutions of the welfare state, all the different welfare provisions. They include transfers, they include public services, such as health and education. They also include industrial policy, and in some countries also include direct state ownership of companies, either part or full ownership, most notably as in the case of China, where we are witnessing to a return of state capitalism under the leadership of Xi Jinping, who has partly reversed the pro-market direction of Deng Xiaoping by repositioning the state as the driver of the economy, to the point that, according to authors such as Joshua Kurlancic, who has a book precisely on state capitalism, the Chinese state controls through full ownership or part ownership more than 60% of the economy. Right? So in a way, state capitalism is back because it has already been back for many years in the Chinese model and is now expanding to other countries. So faced with this historical situation, many people on the left ask what the left should do vis-a-vis the state. Some people question whether the neoliberalism was at all about a reduction of the state. I mean, ideologically, it certainly was. I mean, any of the canonic text of neoliberal thinkers always insists on reducing the state to the minimal state, to the night watchman state, namely to a state that is only engaged in the repressive state apparatuses, using police, using the army, and that's it. As we know, in the actual nature of the neoliberal state, there are also other functions, such as the one of creating markets and regulating markets. But the state has, by and large, during the neoliberal era, over the last 40 years, abandoned much of its economic state apparatuses. I mean, it has decreased its intervention in terms of social security, social welfare, health, and education. It has privatized the companies that it owned or part-owned in most countries. And furthermore, it has abandoned many of the other levers, many of the other legs of sovereignty that the state controlled, industrial policy, commercial policy, trade policy, and so on and so forth. In fact, we could read the neoliberal state as a rearrangement of the different phases of the state, where while the economic state apparatuses were being demolished, were being eroded, for example, under Clinton, radically cutting social security, the repressive state apparatuses were being strengthened. And it's not by chance that under Clinton, while social welfare was destroyed, the incarceration rate skyrocketed. Actually, the same people who were abandoned by the state, were not provided anymore with social welfare provision, were at that point condemned to incarceration. And also, if we look at the classic cases, right, of the first neoliberal governments, Thatcher and Reagan, they both reduced the size of the state as a percentage of GDP, despite their engagement in war, right, which led to an increase in defense spending, right, with the Falkland War and with the end of the Cold War with Reagan. And particularly, they reduced the social face of the state, right? The social state was attacked and demolished. So there is, in fact, a very clear coherence between what neoliberals promised and neoliberals delivered. For much, sometimes on the left, there is a resistance to admit that neoliberalism indeed reduced the power of the state. So all in all, the neoliberal era has resulted in a weakening of the state, and in particular of the social and economic state apparatuses. But what we're witnessing now after the pandemic is instead, as I anticipated before, a return of state interventionism, a return of the interventionist state. Where am I seeing that? I mean, obviously, first and foremost in pandemic policies, very heavy measures such as lockdowns, such as vaccination policies that imply a level of state mobilization that has not been seen for decades, that not even the parents of many of us experienced in their lifetime. One can see it in terms of social provisions that were created for the emergency, furloughed workers programs, the stimulus check, like sent by Donald Trump, and then another one by Biden, things that were quite unprecedented, as well as a return of public investment, massive return of public investment. One of the major areas of cuts under neoliberalism to state budget happened precisely in public investment, in infrastructure investment, which is the reason why now when you go to the US, all the infrastructure looks rusty, bridges are falling down, and when you're taking the underground, it looks as if you are in a Scorsese movie of the 70s, because actually that infrastructure comes very much from the 70s. The state has abandoned that investment because, according to neoliberals, state investment would crowd out private investment. Right? And this has led ultimately to a reduction of state capacity and to a reduction to a crisis of the ability of the state to provide the conditions of production that also capitalism relies on. So what we're seeing in the US with Bidenomics is has to be read as Neostatism that goes hand in hand with a progressive liberalism, whose attempt is obviously not to overcome capitalism, but to save capitalism from itself, right? I mean, as factory laws did back in the days, as Marx commented, is a situation where neoliberalism extreme policies have become dangerous for the very survival of Western capitalism. And therefore, the idea is that the infrastructure, both solid and soft, has to be redesigned in order to give a new boost to capitalism, in order to reset the condition for capitalism efficient operations. So I think I'm approaching the end of my time, so I'll just try to close these with some considerations and some implications for strategy. I mean, these Bidenomics, again, is animated by fears. It is animated by fear of China and fear of the efficiency of Chinese state capitalism that has been demonstrated to be clearly superior to Western minimal state capitalism over the last decades. And it is fear of Trump, because liberal elites in the US have been terribly scared on 6th of January 2021 and are now ready to make some small concessions in terms of providing manufacturing jobs for workers so as to prevent a return of Trump or a return of a Trump lookalike. Will it work? We yet don't know, because we've seen that how even these moderate and modest measures pushed by Biden are encountering major opposition in Congress by people such as Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, who are representing the interest of a section of capital that doesn't want to make any concession. I think that capital now is very much divided, with one section more nostalgic, who wants to remain with business as usual, with neoliberal capitalism as usual, while there is another section of capital that now, in a way, has smelled the coffee and has understood that for its own survival, it needs to bet on something different. Now, for socialists, what does it mean? I mean, it means tactically that Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez are right, and the other socialists in the Democratic Party are right to tactically support the program of Biden, because it can lead to some improvement, perhaps marginal, but concrete, for the life of workers, in terms of social care, in terms of childcare, in terms of maternity, and sick leave pay, which in the US don't exist yet. But I think that the present crisis is very different from social democracy, right, in the 50s and 60s. We don't have anymore the margins of growth that social democracy had, which means that redistribution in this point in time can hardly be non-conflictual, as it was partly at times of high growth. At times of very low growth, as the ones we are living through and that we were probably bound to live through over the next years, redistributing is to a great extent a zero-sum game. It means snatching away money from concentrated hoards, such as those of corporations and the super wealthy, and redistributing it to middle and low income people. Obviously, that is going to be met by huge resistance by the wealthy and corporations, which is precisely the resistance we are witnessing now in Congress, with Sinema and Manchin pushing back against these measures, with the ultimate result that the mild progressive statism that is being waged by Biden may end up failing, and we may well be gearing up for a return of right-wing populism, responding to the failure of neoliberalism and the failure of progressive liberalism to correct neoliberalism, with a return to rabid and chauvinistic communitarianism. Thanks.
Thank you, Paolo. Okay, I'm very aware that as yet no questions have poured in through the YouTube chat function. So while you are all composing those and putting them in, let me just say a couple of thoughts about how I thought there was quite an interesting structure to the whole, in that it seemed to me, as someone relatively naive to the debates, Panagiotis was sort of laying out a kind of theoretical understanding of how we might talk about the state, how it has been talked about through Poulantzas and others. And then Mike was giving us this very historically specific anatomy of the historic block of the state in a British or United Kingdom context from the years of Thatcher to the present. And then Paolo sort of opened things up in a way to look at sort of broader international forces and the very recent history of the state in a time of contraction and in a time of pandemic and so on. So, I mean, I wondered if, as the questions start to come, which I think they are now, are there things you would say to each other? Were there sort of abrasive points between you, or do you feel this was a kind of flow through of analysis without contradiction? Anyone want to come in there? I mean, just to extend that one thing, I always think, like Mike, you were very much, you know, set within the United Kingdom context and what has gone on there, whereas there's also a global dimension. It's something that I never quite can reconcile, in a sense. If one talks about the state, what is the state in relation to a sort of international body of multiple and competing states and fluid capital and so on. And of course, this is at the heart of the debates, isn't it? You know, the relationship of the state to broader capitalist classes and so on. But I mean, why, maybe a question to Mike would be, what does it do if we focus on the United Kingdom context? Does that just tell us about what the state is or has been here? Or is that, in a sense, how all states function, or all states have the capacity to be that and to operate in that way?
I mean, I think my analysis would chime in with a lot of Western Europe and to some degree the US. I think there's a lot of overlaps. I mean, obviously, you know, they have their own specific national sort of histories and dynamics. But yeah, no, I think there's a lot of convergence. I mean, I thought, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, you know, what Paolo was saying and what I was saying, I think there was a lot of overlap. I mean, I agree that this is what I mean. I was kind of also arguing this, that, you know, it is a situation of a zero-sum game. I mean, you know, we're not in the same historical situation. The capacity to make concessions, I think, is much more difficult now than it was, and so you can't really. My argument was that, you know, I think this is true. This is very true all around the place. You know, different national situations. Is that, you know, you're more in a situation of domination without hegemony, because to have hegemony, you do need some material concessions. You do need some, you know, this rational kernel, as I put it, around which consent can be won. And my argument is that, you know, we're not in the same situation now in the sort of Johnson iteration of conservatism as Thatcher was in. Their room for maneuver is much restricted, and capital is divided. It doesn't really know what to do. I think, you know, we're in an impasse that could, what they you know, could block off that sort of possible return to social democracy. And if that happens, then of course, yes, we will see a resurgence of of Trump too, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think they're in a mess, and unfortunately we're also in a mess because we don't have much power. We are spectators of this situation rather than protagonists.
Any of the rest of the panel like to come in on any of those points before we move to audience questions?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps on the general kind of normative issue of the relationship of socialist vis-a-vis the state, I mean, Panagiotis there had something interesting in highlighting that bigger state is obviously not necessarily a socialist state, nor is it necessarily good for the left. Indeed, I think that for many people on the left, precisely because neoliberalism engaged in cutting the state, right, in pushing back the state, most notably during the austerity 2010s, somehow have come to assume that statism is socialism, right? There is also a problem I'm encountering kind of with the argument in my book that people assume that if I'm speaking of neostatism, I'm speaking of socialism or of a positive change necessarily. That is not the case. Yet I think that there is a very major difference between, in political economy, between a neoliberal capitalism, such as the one we've experienced between the 90s and the noughties, and an interventionist capitalism. It really changes the relations of force, not meaning that workers have more power necessarily, but it changes the topology of the relations of force, right? And namely, it opened both new threats for socialists and workers and new opportunities that need to be taken into account, right? It is as if the kind of the rule book really changes. I mean, one opportunity for the left is that usually interventionist capitalism is a more nationalized one, is a more bogged down one. It is one where there is a stronger alliance between the state and corporations, meaning that political decisions are more evidently political from the start, which means that a more bogged down capitalism sometimes makes an easier target, for example, for trade unions, than is the case with an escapist capitalism able to relocate, right, very quickly to another country. So the kind of blackmail power of corporations that they had at the very height of globalization, saying if workers don't accept these wages, we just move to country X. It won't be as strong in the future. It's likely not to be as strong in the future as it was in a golden era, say, of globalization in the 90s and noughties.
Thank you. We've got questions flowing in now, so I'll read the first one from Samali Arichi. Does minimalized economic state apparatus make neoliberal state less powerful? It is apparent that both ideological and repressive state apparatus become much more powerful in neoliberalism, or in terms of class struggle, or does it make the state less visible? Anybody want to respond to that, the sort of power, visibility, invisibility axis of the state under neoliberalism?
I can try and say a few words. I mean, the neoliberal state obviously was not a weak state. It was very strong on the repressive side, especially in the phase of the neoliberal onslaught, with all the many unimportant battles against unions, against social movements, etc. Britain has a very long, in Britain especially, this was very violent, but also in other countries. And it was also very strong, the neoliberal state, in its attempt to create markets. If you look at processes such as the privatization of energy through the creation of quasi-markets, I'm referring mainly to the European Union context, and you see the actual extent of state measures, legislation produced, regulation produced, and even violent attempts, for example, to force nationalized or previously nationalized monopolistic energy providers to open up, then you can see that neoliberalism required a strong state in crucial aspects. So I think this is obvious. At the same time, there was an idea, in a certain way, the ideological mystification was exactly the rhetoric of less state. Actually, it was a transformation of the state, a state with less provision, less social provision, less intervention in the economy in terms that might be favorable to the subaltern classes, but it was not a smaller state. It was never a night watchman state. And it's also interesting that it was also never a less spending state. If you look at the statistics, state spending did not really, so it was less spending on social terms, but in other aspects of state spending, it also remained. But I think that it is interesting, just to follow up on what Paolo was saying, how we're witnessing elements of a transformation, which are different in different contexts. I mean, the US context is perhaps more interesting, although it is still at stake in a certain way, because exactly in the US you had a stronger sense of social contestation. In the European context, for example, it is different. If you look at countries such as Italy, if you look at Greece, for example, Greece, we're in a period of a new round of neoliberalist, again, even more neoliberal structuring, and in a certain way, the state of exception created by the pandemic has been used to that extent. So I think it depends upon the extent to which this increased state intervention can be put, let's say, into good use by from the part of social movements, has to do exactly with the extent to which there are strong social movements and that actually can change the balance of forces. And it's interesting that it seems that we have a comeback of social movements in some countries, and in other countries we're still within the contours of defeat, which in a way brings us back to the very relational consolidation of the state.
Anybody else want to come in on this question? Okay, we can stay with Pangiotis, and Chris Gilbert has a question. Panagiotis refers to a conception of dual power in Lenin that is not transitory, but rather lasting. Could you explain further?
Yes, no, in Lenin, the conception of dual power is transitory. All the texts on dual power refer to a very specific moment. It would be a distortion of philological to say that Lenin had a conception of a permanent dual power. However, I do think that there is a more strategic character in how he views the Soviets, at least in writing such a State and Capital and some of the initial interventions before Lenin gets entangled into the very everyday management of a socialist state in a situation of civil war. And many of Lenin's interventions begin to be very, very time specific. For example, if you look at the trade union debates, which I used as an example. However, I think that we need to think of dual power as a more permanent process. That is, we really need to think of a process where both the state is transformed, and it is transformed by the existence of forms of political and economic and social organization and intervention that are in a certain way autonomous for the state, and in this sense form part of a broader, let's say, transitional integral state, to use Marxist, to use Gramsci's, definition, that it is in a process of a profound transformation, what can be metaphorically perhaps described as withering away, not in the sense that it is not a form of political institutionalization in a certain sense, but exactly in the sense of a constant radical democratization and the need for experimentations, exactly as means for the emergence of new social relations and configurations. This aspect of experimentation that in a certain way, I think that Marx refer to when it says how the state, in the critique of the Gotha program, how is the state going to be formed, the state in the transition to communism? And they say the answer can only be answered scientifically, and scientifically means by means of experiment. It does not mean in an abstract, theoretical way. So this is so I prefer to deal that to refer to that as a process of permanent dual power, exactly to stress the contradictory character, rather than, let's say, just a process of democratization of the state, or the emergence of a democratic integral state, perhaps have emerged in various debates, because in that sense we would not go beyond Hegel. And I'm referring to Hegel because Hegel actually has a very, very complex and not at all, reactionary conception of how a state might be. If you look at beyond some of the solutions that he gives, the articulation of civil society, the way he describes civil society, even the way he describes the police function in civil society, what institutions are placed within civil society and what institutions are placed within the state, and the need for an organic relation. This in a way is a very progressive form, the most progressive, perhaps potential form of the state. But I think that Marx thought that social transformation can be a step beyond that. It's not easy to define it, and of course it's not the management of things, this technocratic Saint-Simonian utopia sometimes associated with this conception. It's still political, it's still institutional, it still requires forms of power and authority, but it is a much more open and transformational process. And I think that although at this time our tactical demands might be indeed tactical demands for stronger state intervention in favor of the subaltern classes, we still need to retain a more strategic thinking, still trying to think to the limit, that is, still trying to think both within and beyond the state.
Thanks. We've got a question from Dougie Booth for Paolo. The trend under neoliberalism was to undergo shrinkage of economic state capacity, with the neo-statist ambition to reverse this. Do you see any possible problems for this?
I mean, the problems they obviously see is that what we are seeing is perhaps what could be described as a contractor state, especially in the US. So it's a state that contracts out much public spending, investment to other firms, rather than directly delivering projects and infrastructure. So it's a state that ultimately risks being merely a facilitator again of private initiative. And I think where the question of ownership becomes, which is a fundamental question for socialists and Marxists, becomes very evident once again. I mean, who actually, not only who spends, but who actually controls the economy, who controls the commanding heights of the economy, right? Namely the strategic enterprises, strategic companies, for example, strategic energy companies, right? So I think that, for example, nationalizing energy companies at a time of climate crisis, when we need to do a very fast transformation towards renewable energy and a different system of transportation, is a very urgent demand. It is a progressive demand. It is in fact a demand that is being voiced by many socialists around Europe and the US. I mean, I think honestly, when I'm thinking about the withering of the state, for me, in Marx and Engels was more of a vanishing point rather than a real point of strategy. It's a bit like Mazzini talking about the vanishing or the withering away of people. I mean, the theories of national people, as Mazzini, he was theorizing ultimately that at some point nations would wither away, right? So it was a bit part of the 19th century way of thinking, I think, like this kind of very long-term perspective, right? So to me, a kind of serious engagement and strategic engagement with the state is something that, in a way, is extremely urgent for Marxists. Something where the blind spots in theory that are part of the Marxist tradition need to be faced head on. The opportunity our phase gives us is that by the role of the state becoming ideologically more visible, because the kind of fig leaf of self-regulating market has fallen, it becomes also easier to actually pin down the political character of economic decisions, given that they're more imbricated in the state. So again, it's not necessarily a positive change, but there are certain changes in the rules of the game that may be used by us as political opportunities.
Thanks. So we have a question for everyone from Caterina Principe about European integration. So the role of the state in the process of European integration. Beyond the concept of internalization, wouldn't you say there is a structural transformation of the member states in ways that they push processes of legitimation onto the supranational, technocratic, undemocratic EU structures? And if you agree with this premise, would you say there is a shift in the traditional nature of the state, even if its function of guaranteeing capital accumulation does not change? Who'd like to come in on that question of European integration?
Yeah, I mean, I can say something here. So, I mean, yes, I think European integration has been changing aspects of the state. And that's precisely why conservatism in this country reacted so furiously, or a strand of it did, that sort of nationalistic reactionary conservatism reacted so furiously to the long-term trend, which they felt, I think, would hollow out some of the powerful institutions and ideologies of the nation state that they have very successfully monopolized. So, you know, like, as I mentioned, the European Court of Justice, they hate that. And I think, you know, they see it as, or saw it as, a threat to their sort of power block. But I mean, what the European integration, the contradiction there is that really, you know, the nation state has been where some kind of political authority and legitimacy can be established, whereas the European supranational state is precisely about lifting decisions up to a level where the population has even less access to accountability and pressure on the powerful than they do at the national level. And that's been the contradiction. You know, all the resistance in Europe against that sort of consolidation of power is because, you know, people sense that they're, you know, it's being drained away. Even though it kind of at one level makes sense for capitalism to do that in order to kind of operate internationally, at another level, at the level of kind of authority, and sort of having a kind of democratic facade, if you want to call it that, you know, it's hollowing that out. So again, you've got a contradiction between the sort of economic international dimension of capitalism and it's the national basis of its political authority.
Anyone else want to come in on the question of Europe and its union?
Well, I can say a few words. Well, I think this is a very important point because sometimes not given enough attention in studies of the state. Because in the European context, part of the transformations associated with what we discussed as the neoliberal state in all its aspects were exactly the result of European integration, which is very, very interesting and dialectical process where a condition of limited sovereignty, limited national state sovereignty, was necessary for an expansion of the actual new forms of neoliberal power consolidation and institutional arrangement. So, but it's also very important how European integration, enhanced and certain aspects of the neoliberal transformation of the state, such as, for example, the insulation of very important decision processes from any form of actual, democratic discussion, participation, control, or intervention from the part of the subaltern classes. And in a certain way, especially for peripheral bourgeoisies, such as the case of Greece or Portugal, since Katarina Principe is the one asking the question, was exactly part of the, let's say, Faustian deal of peripheral bourgeoisies with the European integration. We accept this setting of sovereignty, including, something like monetary sovereignty, exactly because we see that in the long run, this transformation of the state as part of European integration, along, of course, with larger market, etc., will enhance our social power also at the national level, and can explain why, because it's different, for example, from countries of the European center, where there are very obvious economic advantages of the current institutional and monetary architecture of the European Union. But when it comes to the periphery, it seems like a contradiction, but it's not a contradiction, because it was a major force of capitalist restructuring and, in the end, of strengthening the power of capital, which was a process of both internalization of European mandates within national legislation, national institutional arrangements, and at the same time the continuous existence of various forms of supranational forms of control, which also can explain why, especially in the European Union context, any possibility to think of these potentially positive aspects, of increased state intervention can only come through some form of, reclaiming forms of sovereignty from the part of the European Union. Otherwise, this can explain why the European Union, even in this process of transformation of the state, will remain in a very strong neoliberal direction, exactly because this is organically inscribed in the very process of integration.
Thanks. Okay, extending the frame a bit, Dougie Booth asks us, thinking maybe about the issue of profitability and financial burden on the state. Maybe China is the exception of successfully rebuilding economic state capacity because of a higher rate of profit. Anyone got any thoughts on China and the state?
Yeah, partly China, as we know, had a very different path vis-a-vis Russia, post-Soviet Russia, and that is what saved the Chinese economy, as also Adam Tooze and others have been writing on recently. And the crisis, the mini financial crisis of 2015, convinced the Chinese leadership to reverse much of the process of market openness and financialization that was developing in the country. And the situation is very different in the West, right? In the Europe and the US, where we have instead a situation that comes close to kind of zero growth. I mean, for many years, not intentional zero growth, but that's what we are getting. Growth that is very low at the time of apparent kind of saturation of markets, overcapacity. And in this context, I think the role of the state is very different from, I think this is actually a very interesting research question. I mean, how is this return of the state we are witnessing now, or the state interventionism, different from the state interventionism we had during the kind of Trente Glorieuses, so-called, right, the 30 golden years of the social democratic consensus in the post-war period. And I think, one fundamental difference is that this is a state that is concerned more with protecting vis-a-vis danger and protecting vis-a-vis climate change. I think on that, things are changing quite significantly, in the sense that even in the European Union, right? The kind of poster child of neoliberalism, the most austerity-prone trading bloc. We are seeing that now there is a little bit more leeway towards state spending on green transition, right? Even in Europe, the Growth and Stability Pact has been suspended, is going to be renegotiated, is going probably to be a bit more lax than it was. But then I think in the future, we're going to see all sorts of farcical actions on the stage of politics, including accounting tricks to allow neoliberals to maintain their fig leaf. For example, the EFPD in Germany, perhaps they're discussing about not counting green investment in the debt, so that they could pretend that they are maintaining the debt brake, while in fact they are going against their own dogma. And probably after the Next Generation EU, we are going to have more Europe-wide investment in green technology. But for a very simple fact, that the crisis now has gotten to the point where capital itself, or at least a significant section of capital, is getting really concerned about its long-term investments. So I think that is, for me, what is interesting, in a sense that neoliberalism has failed even capitalists at this point, in many respects, right? Which is, to me, the only way we can understand Bidenomics, right? Why did someone as moderate and centrist as Biden do something like that nobody expected, I think, like among us and in the audience? Why is that? Because neoliberalism has failed even capitalists, right? They don't trust it anymore. It is not a reliable regime of accumulation anymore. In a way, it has exhausted its potential, right? Also because there's very little left to privatize, that there's very little left to turn towards the logic of neoliberalism. Therefore, I think that some elements of the system are betting on a different model, right? Which is this more kind of state interventionist model. That means that we need to approach it with extreme caution, because it's not our project, right? But it also means that it can offer some opening for radical intervention.
Judith McVeigh asks, given the authoritarian nature of the structures of capitalist states, to what extent were the policies of Syriza naive in attempting to capture the state apparatus for the use of the left? Who would like to come in on that, I wonder?
I can say, I would be happy if he had tried indeed to capture the state and even failed to do so. It did not. It simply accepted a very specific institutional arrangements, as it were, including a very harsh form of supervision and constant surveillance and constant intervention from the part of the European Union. But it is indeed that this was also one of the problems, because even some minor institutional changes were part of the order of the day, but they always felt that they were somehow external to the state, not in the sense of antagonizing the state, but of running it without actually being able to control all aspects of it. But this discussion took place in Greece in a very instrumental way, and not with a strategic orientation which was necessary, especially since it was a discussion that took place in conditions of a defeat, both at the political level and, of course, in a certain way, a sense of desperation and disaggregation in the part of the subaltern classes. So, unfortunately, Greece could have been an experiment in whether the state can be used, what changes need to be made, how it can be articulated with autonomous movements. It was, before 2015, a testing ground or an experimental site. but unfortunately the experiment was not performed to its full extent in order to leaving us more with open questions. This would be my assessment. But at least it points to one direction, at least one point, that the state is a materialized class strategy to a large extent. It's not something new. It's not an instrument. And Syriza confronted this, but was defeated by this. It did not really have a strategy to do something with the state. And of course, it did not have a strategy to deal with the state in its particular European articulation. This is the thing we discussed before, as Katarina Principe referred to, which is this articulation of both an internalization of processes of European integration and also a constant interplay between the national and the international, which was a very difficult task. I believe that social conditions were there, in the sense of strong movements. Unfortunately, there was not any prior actual strategic thinking and, let's say, strategic initiative, autonomous strategic initiative to actually deal with this challenge, which would have opened and is a very original historical process, which will be, we don't know where it would have ended, but it would have been really more interesting than what we're witnessing right now. And of course, and much better for the subaltern classes and the working people of Greece.
There are two questions for Paolo. I'll put them both together, though they're quite different. So Martin McBennett asks, do you think that the rise of Sinn Féin in Ireland has as much to do with its creation of a left Republican political narrative as a left populist response to the general crisis? And Mike Morrow asks, Paolo's analytically separating the repressive, ideological and economic apparatuses of the state is useful, but in my opinion would benefit from inclusion of the technological. It might be that more of you, Mike, as well, might like to respond on that question of whether there's a technological state apparatus, but perhaps Paolo first, just something on Ireland, republicanism, populism, and then the question of the technological.
Yes, I don't know too much about Irish politics and Sinn Féin. Obviously we've all been following the news and seeing, and many people who know the situation more closely make an argument that indeed it has to do partly with organizational processes, with Sinn Féin building up this momentum for years and years. It partly has to do with the way in which it has adopted a kind of left populist platform, right? But I don't know how much I can say on that, though it is obviously a very interesting phenomenon happening there. And in terms of the other question could you repeat it, Esther? I got too focused on Sinn Féin.
Yeah, sure. It's just a question about, you talk about repressive, ideological and economic state apparatuses. What about the technological? How might that play with those?
Yes, indeed. Technology now has become, technology and the state are closely related. They've always been. And on that, Poulantzas is very enlightening, and Foucault and many others. Right? How much the state is about technology. For a long time, we thought, though, that technology was a word fact, to kind of quote Marx, and that it was inherently globalization-led or focused. Well, now we realize that digital sovereignty is a big debate now, right? With different states having different platforms, states partly becoming platforms, right? Becoming platforms that where citizens, users can access different services, right? After the platform company and the platform party, the platform state seems like the overdue thing. But this term economic state apparatuses is a bit of like my coinage, though for sure somebody has already used a similar term. But to me is about the striking fact that the state is so embedded in contemporary capitalism, in the contemporary economy. And in fact, I think that the kind of secular trend, except for a neoliberal exception, is of an ever greater penetration of the state in more and more aspects of our lives, partly precisely because of the technological nature of society. The more technological society, the more likely is that the state will become pervasive. And that is why, I mean, Poulantzas in State, Power and Socialism was warning against the risk of authoritarian statism, right? At least, I mean, it wasn't that predictive because, I mean, there was the authoritarian statism of Margaret Thatcher for sure, and Chile. But then actually in the 80s, like neoliberalism began, which was quite different in direction. But obviously, we will need to confront also this danger that Poulantzas was signaling almost, I mean, 40 years ago, right? More than 40 years ago in his last book. I mean, this risk of returning authoritarianism through the state.
Any other thoughts on technology amongst the panel?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, no, it's a massive problem. I think, you know, in China, they're leading the way, I think, in this, in terms of the authoritarian surveillance state, you know, with tracking of citizens and facial recognition and chipping workers, I think, someone mentioned to me the other day. So, yeah. I think it just sort of coming back, I think one of the important bits of the debate that Panagiotis has raised in particular, but is that, you know, we mustn't confuse bigger state with socialism. And it is amazing, actually. You would have thought the lessons had been learned, but it is amazing how nostalgic people are for kind of Stalinist revivals, you know. The British Communist Party has a real soft spot for China still, which, you know, it staggers me, but these things are, we still have to have these debates that this is not socialism.
We've got a question from Brian Donnelly. How do you see the rise of virulent populisms in America, no less than Brazil or Hungary, in the question of the states? It seems to be a profoundly disruptive wildcard to both markets and conservatism. Who wants to come in on that question of populism and the state?
Well, if I can say a few words, although I suppose Paolo has a lot more to say on that. He's more specialist. I think that sometimes it's interesting that we've had in relationship to what we usually call as populist far right, both an attempt to take advantage of the situation of the pandemic and rebrand themselves as friends of liberty. You can point to the situation in Brazil, which is very anti-destructive way they handled the pandemic. But also they have gone in a more authoritarian way. I mean, far-right populisms in Europe generally have turned in a more authoritarian way, generally supporting restrictive measures. Although there have been far-right politicians also in Europe who have tried to take advantage of protests against the restrictive measures, etc., and you can see it. But this depends on the specific context of its countries. So I still think that what most populists currently present is exactly two elements. One is that they still try to cover a certain gap. But with all this invocation of an imaginary people or an imaginary nation, they try to cater exactly for the need for some sort of community. Of course, their community is very restrictive, oppressive, and exclusionary of large segments of actual societies, because they are also very, very racist. And on the other hand, they point to the constant, let's say, fascination with a very authoritarian or even Bonapartist conception of politics. And in some cases, even processes of even almost neo-fascist elements. However, it's always interesting that although we tend to, pinpoint the populists or the far right, the crucial point is their actual dialogue with changes in the state. If you look at the French example, for example, okay, there's all this fear what Zemmour will mean and how this kind of very openly racist, conspirationalist conception of the far right with almost fascist references emerges as a threat to the political system. But at the same time, it is in a certain dialogue with the extreme authoritarian turn of, for example, Macron himself, as we have witnessed, for example, during the Liaison demonstrations and also later, all the new forms of institutionalized racism, or the new forms of state racist discourse emerging, for example, in the French Codex. So I think this is a very interesting aspect that although far-right populism has been in the past couple of years denounced in all aspects, and of course the American situation contributed to it, trying to present the populist far right as something that is outcast from the political spectrum and the political mainstream, it in certain way it represents the ugliest but yet real face of the actual political mainstream, and this is something that we must take into consideration.
I mean, I think it was extraordinary how Trump assaulted the institutions of the American state. The media, the FBI, the CIA, the intelligence apparatus. I mean, he came into conflict with all of those institutions. So it's an incredibly contradictory phenomenon. This sort of radicalized right, and it could go off in lots of different directions. And as we know, it wasn't a serious coup attempt. It wasn't serious, but there was a rallying that was of people to assault the institutions of the American sort of democratic state, which was fairly unprecedented. So it is a very interesting and dangerous thing. I think that's why Biden had made that extraordinary move to go back to Paolo's point. It was unexpected because Trump still got, how many was it, 75 million votes, I think. I mean, he's still huge, and I think that scared the life out of them. It scared the life out of them what the implications were. But still, I mean, I think it's still the same structures trying to solve these problems which they cannot solve. And this is why, again, I was sort of saying, until the left can break away from liberalism and break in to this space on an independent sort of political basis, then we're just going to oscillate between these poles, and things are just going to get worse.
I think the final question relates to this, so I'll pose it to you and ask you to sort of use this as your wrapping up statement. So it's from Michael Bray. What effects do the increasing coercive forces of states have for dual power strategies? Have those powers and the insulation of apparatuses weakened the impact of popular forces on states? So let me ask you to do your summary in response to that, if you wish, or otherwise.
I mean, I think that a major element of the weakening of the state, of the social state under neoliberalism, was its de-democratization. I mean, the elimination of democratic control over the state, which led to technocracy, which led to different functions, move to supranational institutions, as most clearly in the case of the European Union. The risk now, and this was something that actually Poulantzas was cautioning when he was talking about authoritarian statism, what he was saying is that a state that has greater control over the economy, and if that coincides with a reduction of the power of political institutions that is dangerous. I think we are facing again the same danger, in the sense that we have a return of planning, we have a return of state power in terms of investment. That may be accompanied by a return of a technocracy, especially in terms of climate planning, is going to produce huge resistance from sectors of the population. We're going to see green transition policies as an imposition, and all sorts of conspiracy theories are going to fly around. The only solution to that is to bring more democracy in the picture, to have bottom-up participation, to have democratic planning, to create ways in which citizens can be involved in the process of decision-making. And I think that that is the old challenge of democratizing the state, which is alluded to in Marx's famous quote, according to which freedom consists in its conversion of the state from an organ superimposed on society into one completely subordinated to it. So it is a process of reabsorption, of re-internalization of the very state, whose problem is that sometimes stands opposite to society, right? And in coercing society, disciplining society, while it should be re-internalized, reabsorbed, and used by society as a political institution to govern itself and plan its destiny collectively, rather than being something external.
So I think I sort of point to an experience, a year I spent in Venezuela in 2008, where these sort of questions about dual power were very concrete and still are, because what you had there, I think, was an oil state, a very corrupt oil state that had been in place for almost 100 years, releasing resources in order for new institutions, which the Venezuelans called missions, to build sort of more popular forms of power and initiative. And what I saw in Venezuela was that kind of sense of popular power, experimentation, popular initiative, which Pangiotis talked about. What's interesting to me was that the program was essentially social democratic. They were just getting stuff which, you know, we in the West had taken for granted, although no longer, but we had taken for granted for a very long time. The program was essentially social democratic, but what was interesting was that the form was revolutionary. You know, it relied on mass participation, radicalization, raising of class consciousness, and the possibility for kind of posing the kind of questions where millions of people were thinking about and participating in transforming their society, and were conscious that the state was a problem as well as a resource. So I think, you know, for me, to kind of make it concrete, that's a kind of interesting mediation, a revolutionary form with a social democratic program, because that's where people, that's for example, in this country, that's where people are. Millions of people voted for Corbyn's social democratic program, but there wasn't any popular, real, you know, movement behind it. So that's one reason why it failed. There was no real popular mobilization. But as a way of mediating between where people are now and where you want to go, I think, you know, those kinds of that kind of program has a possibility, because I think that to get even social democracy now, you're going to need a revolution.
Well, I think that Michael just put the actual challenge, which in a certain way encapsulates the current, you know, balance of forces. That you need a tremendous show of force, a tremendous kind of disruptive intervention of the subaltern classes in order even to have minor, social democratic progressive change. This is what we're dealing with. But I think that Michael Bray's question is really important. Yes, the neoliberal states became much more authoritarian, and part of this authoritarianism was exactly the reduction of the space for social movements, the reduction of the ability to have, parallel structures, the reduction of the ability of social movements to emerge as forms of counterpower from below. This is true, and also they also reduced even the space for institutionalized social movement bargaining. I mean, in cases like I already referred to the European context, or Greece during the period of the austerity measures, people realized that the traditional, for example, let's say, political calculation of cost was not there. Traditionally, there is a calculation of political cost. You stage lots of strikes, governments take account of them. They might not react. They do not want to be defensive, but they realize they might have an electoral cost, and they at least try to find a midway with social movements. This was not working. I mean, in the Greek context at that period, only major scale social explosions could actually do something, and not in the sense of forcing governments to change strategy, but in the sense of radically altering political relations of representation and enabling the possibility that the left will reach governmental power. This is, and if you also see it in other contexts today, you can see the same in different, perhaps different degrees, but the same contradictory dynamic. Yes, you can have very big social movements, you can have social explosions. They find ways to be translated into politics. They affect the balance of forces. You can see it, for example, in electoral results or in electoral tendencies, but they are not mediated by the kind of autonomous subaltern organizations that would actually guarantee that this dynamic remains focused on certain instances. And this creates a very contradictory situation for activists, either to fully immerse into electoral politics with all the limitations, or to go into the opposite direction, a kind of new movementism that leaves aside any consideration of politics. And I think part of rethinking in a kind of a dual power strategy, I think what it means for today's actions is exactly the need to refound these mediating moments, both the notion of the autonomous social movement in its full strength and what it means, not just as a way to struggle, but also as a way to create alternative social configurations and forms, but also to think its articulation a struggle for the state and against the state at the same time. That is the question of political power, which still remains central in any process of social transformation. And I think that these are very, very pertinent questions today, facing also, in certain cases, new forms of authoritarianism, and part of the measures associated with the pandemic also pointed to that direction. And it's also, I think, what Paolo said is very, very important. The changes we need, especially in regards to impending catastrophes like climate change, are violent changes. Violent changes in the productive paradigm, in everyday habits, in everyday consumption practices, in ways of life. This can be thought of in a very authoritarian way, a kind of a climate change Leviathan. I refer to the book of a recent book which posed this, which was very, very interesting, in a form of a very authoritarian conception, top down. It cannot be done by the forces of the market. It will lead to failure. But I think we can envisage an alternative which is equally deep in the extent of transformation and equally violent in the extent of the changes, but it also involves, people in it. And to give just an example, you need the coercive, the despotic power of the state to nationalize energy, change energy direction from fossil fuel to renewable energy, this is in that you need concentrated power to do it, and in a violent way. At the same time, if you are thinking of a decentralized, less energy consuming, productive paradigm, you need all forms of associative, collective self-management practices that could put in practice a productive paradigm, but for at least in what in advanced capitalist societies would mean significantly less consumption of energy, and thus be an actual sustainable mode of production. So you need both the kind of concentrated revolutionary state potential, but forms of power, collective ingenuity, experimentation, and creativity from below to deal with contemporary challenges. I think this is what we're facing.
Thank you to our three speakers for starting Historical Materialism 2021 conference and giving us so much to think about. We hope that the audience will join us for lots more events over the next 11 days, and also we hope you take notice of our book series, including Pangiotis' book and many others, and there are particular offers abroad from Haymarket currently. We also draw your attention to the journal of which this conference draws its organizers, and we hope that you subscribe and will support us. We also draw your attention to the new Historical Materialism podcast, first episode of which was out last week, I believe, with members of the editorial board discussing political